Quintrell, as Alex introduced me. I am one of the medical educators with Genova Diagnostics. I also work in a clinic for Embracing Nutrition. I don't know if any of you know Jo Gamble, but so I work closely with her. So I'm hoping today to bring a lot of my clinical experience into talking and explaining about the NutrEval and the Metabolomix. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the NutrEval as a whole test. I know a few of you have asked me about the differences. So that's my main goal, is to really go through what the difference is between the NutrEval, the Metabolomix, the sort of segments of the NutrEval as a whole test. So let's use this. Oh, I have no idea how to move this. Hold on, guys. All right, we're probably not going to use this thing. So objectives, the most obviously important slide of the deck. So 3 main objectives today, mainly just going to give you the overview of the NutrEval. So just having a look at the whole test, sort of the when and the whys you use it. I think the clinical applications of this test are so varied and super, super important as well. So I really want that to be the main takeaway, is the when, the why, the how you'd use this test. And also the breakdown of the segments of the NutrEval. So as I said, it's kind of like one big massive test that houses 4 tests. Oh, thanks. That houses like 4 different tests basically within it. So we're going to go through those. I'll explain that as we go through, so hopefully it's a lot clearer. Of course, if you have any questions, I'm actually really open to this being a bit more interactive. So if you want to ask me a question as we go through, or if something's just not quite clear enough, please just ask. Okay, let's move on. Oh my goodness.
Other way.
Nailed it. Okay, so firstly, just want to start with 2 concepts for testing. So functional versus direct testing. As a foundation, when you're choosing what test to choose for your clients, it's really important to know basically what you're looking to find out. So as a starting point, what are they? So a direct measure or a direct measurement is basically the concentration of a nutrient in that specific sample. So think of basically getting a blood test, like your serum B12, for instance. It's just measuring how much B12 or concentration of B12 is in that specific sample. So it is usually a blood test in most scenarios. And then we have functional testing, which is assessing how much of the nutrient is there, but also how well is the body utilizing it. And that can then enable us to identify the need for additional support. So we very much describe the NutrEval as a functional nutrient assessment, which you'll find out as we go through. So, oh, it's so confusing. Okay, we've got it. We're going to get this by the end of this presentation. So, I don't know if any of you have come across this concept before. If not, then I'm excited to be the first one to tell you about it. I'm just going to use the analogy of the NutrEval being like a car service. So it's the way I tend to describe it to clients of mine, but in general, it's just a really good idea of how to look at this test. So for the sake of the analogy, we're going to assume the body is basically like a car. And obviously every car needs different types of fuel, different types of oil. There's also different types of quality of fuel and oil that go into them, etc. And you don't know where any of the levels of those are. So even things like your brake fluid, your wiring, etc. You don't know how those things are functioning. You don't know what the levels are at without checking them. So this is when we have to take the car into service. And very much so, as we have a car, things can go wrong, especially if we're not aware of issues that might be there. And so the only way to know is through testing or car servicing. And if we don't do that, we might find, we have faulty wires, we have to like change parts, our brakes break. All of those aspects can happen. So it's really important, as we see, like when we get a brand new car, that we want to put it in for a service straight away. That's essentially how I see a new client, not as a car, but very much I want to just know how they're working, where their levels are at, are they getting all the nutrients in, just as a starting point. I want to know the function of their bodily functions, basically. So then I would also always introduce the NutrEval as an option there. So I very much see this as a starting point test. As I said, as you would with a new client, it just provides you with that information of their current health state, their nutrient imbalances, what isn't working efficiently, are they even getting in the right amount of fuel, all of that sort of thing is what you would learn, hopefully, And then from that point, you can then address certain areas that need support. So we'll have a look at obviously the main page, which is a really great representation of key areas that you might want to focus on. So you can then go away, obviously focus on that specific area, and then maybe retest just that area. You wouldn't necessarily have to do a whole other service after that. And so as again with a car service, you have like the full-blown car service, which is really, you know, the top end, expensive, but it looks at everything as well, most things as a whole. That's kind of like the NutrEval, but then you could just do smaller services just to see how generally they're getting on in other areas, and that's kind of like the Metabolomix. So we'll go into that in a bit more depth. I will certainly point that out as we go through. But yeah, it's just a really nice overview of just how is someone working, where are their nutrient imbalances, can I support them in all of these specific areas. So what's included? It is a urine and blood test, so it does require a blood draw, which means your client will have to see a phlebotomist. There is also a centrifuging sample as well, which is for the homocysteine, but the urine components are the Metabolomix themselves. So the first sort of 2/3 of the test is the Metabolomix, and that includes the organic acids, the oxidative stress markers, and the amino acids. And then we move on to the rest of the test, which as a whole is the NutrEval, and that will include antioxidants, so CoQ10, glutathione, homocysteine, it has vitamin D. We look at nutrients and toxic elements, and also essential fatty acids. Okay, so let's have a look at a report. So this is your front page of a NutrEval that you would receive. It's essentially like a report card. So you'll find it's color-coded and it is given a functional imbalance score. So the color code is kind of like a traffic light system. So there is no green, but if there was green, that would mean there's a minimal or low need for support. Yellow is moderate, red would be a high need. So obviously in this case, mitochondrial dysfunction is the main area, and then the rest are other key areas that we probably want to put in some support alongside. The functional imbalance score, this is generated from the biomarkers that you can see listed in the categories. Oh, let's try this thing. These are the biomarkers here. So you can see that they have either a triangle or a circle. If they have a triangle, they are driving that imbalance score. If it's pointing upwards, it will be a higher reading. If it's pointing downwards, that means it's a lower reading within a reference range, which we'll talk about. So overall, you can clearly see where your client is going to need direct support pretty much straight away, and then other areas that you might want to focus on sort of next or further down the line. Scoring wise, the range is 0 to 10. So 0 will be your best score, 10 basically your worst score. One last thing, I actually find this in particular quite a good page as well to compare your results when you retest. So it just helps you to monitor progress as well. You can see, you know, if you're working on oxidative stress, for instance, and then you come to retest, you can literally see from the first page where your progress is. So key categories. So we categorize the biomarkers into these 5 key groups. So oxidative stress, so measuring for free radical damage, possible damage to lipids, so fats, also proteins, which can impact things like cell membranes, DNA. And this for me is a huge section. It correlates with just so many conditions, underlie things like cardiovascular disease, aging, etc. So I think like the first 2 categories in particular are certainly my favorites. And mitochondrial dysfunction is the second category. That these 2 I'm always focusing on, especially in my clinic. If they come up as key areas, I really want to make sure that they're very much in the green zone. So mitochondrial dysfunction, we're looking at this in relation to cellular energy production, so things like insulin resistance, cardiovascular disease, even mood disorders, cognitive decline, sleep disorders, and so on. We also look at omega imbalance, so assessing for if there's inflammatory support that we need to put in place, the balance between essential fats such as omega-3 and 6, whether there's trans fats present, and so on. And we also then look at toxic exposure, so looking at environmental toxins in particular, so toxicity from petrochemicals and plastics. And then the last category we have is methylation imbalance. So looking for whether we need methylation cofactors, so B12, folate, things like that. This particular category is very much helpful for those clients who were suspecting there is poor methylation. And you'll see just generally as a whole page, we have categorized them, but actually as a whole, they underpin a whole multitude of health concerns, which is what makes these tests so versatile when it comes to clinical application. Like I said, I'm going to really point out the mitochondria and the oxidative stress because they're just so heavily researched in so many conditions and a really key aspect of this test. So, looking at the nutrient need overview, this is essentially your second page of the report that you've received. It is showing the findings of the test, which then we can provide a personalized nutrient recommendation for obviously these nutrients listed, and that's determined using an algorithm. We do separate it into categories because it's just then much more easily utilized when it comes to assessing how to support your clients best. So we first and foremost look at, obviously, this will relate to the categories that you saw on page 1. So obviously, if oxidative stress markers are raised, we're going to expect to see the antioxidants more in need. Obviously, methylation or certain neurotransmitter pathways, if they're impacted, we're going to expect to see B vitamins raised, etc. So this kind of can be seen as like a protocol if you wanted to look at it that way, but also allows you to assess where you want to focus support for clients. So say you've got a client who doesn't really want to take supplements. You can then prioritize, say, B vitamins in this scenario if they're predominantly all on the high end, and then maybe tackle things like the minerals through food sources, things like that. So it means you can be super targeted with your approach, and yeah, just really specialized basically. And obviously it shows your client literally on a piece of paper where they need support and when they need it most, which is obviously a really helpful tool to have. So you will see along the right-hand side up here, the suggested recommended dosages. So this particular page is in relation to age and gender of your clients as well. So the dosages will change depending on obviously the client that's gone through the test. They are just suggested. We're not telling you to take that dose. It's just based on the test findings. This is what we would recommend supporting their needs basically. So we do have a blank column if you wanted to make your own annotations, absolutely fine to do that. But just so you know where we would pitch it, you've got a starting point there. And then right at the bottom of this page, we have the amino acids, which are a really useful tool to have on hand, especially when you're looking at like neurotransmitter pathways. But this initial section here is just giving you an indication of whether they're in need of amino acids. So zeros, which are predominantly here, that means there's a low need or there isn't a particular need for all of those amino acids. If there's a number, so taurine here in particular is in need. So that's the number that's there is how much we're saying that they might need to support that particular amino acid. That section is much better looking at it as a whole when we come to the amino acids, because it can tell us a lot about protein intake, digestion of protein, etc. So interpretation at a glance. So we have several pages of these. So after page 2, we come on to this whole section. It's just addressing individual nutrients that we saw from page 2, giving their function, deficiency causes, complications, etc. My personal one that I use the most is the food sources, which is the red one. And that's just a really nice one. You can copy and paste it, put it into your plans. When you know, let's say a client needs lots of, I don't know, magnesium, you can copy and paste food sources, pop it into your plan. Some people make it into nice little charts, which looks really nice. But that's the most useful. It also just gives clients an opportunity to educate themselves a bit more on certain nutrients, why they're important, why they're deficient, why and what that looks like. So it's actually a really useful tool. For your reference, the key is at the bottom of each page as well. Yeah. So reference range. So this is the reference range we use for the NutrEval Metabolomics, the same. The reference range is the green and yellow combined. that is the whole reference range. If something is in the green, that is basically the optimal zone. That's where obviously we want our client's results to be or to get to that point. And that is to 1 standard deviation. The yellow is sort of borderline area. To 2 standard deviations to the reference range. As I like to think of it, it's more the eyebrow raiser zone. And then we have the red, which is obviously outside of that reference range. It can be high, can be low, totally depends on the marker. And obviously that's the key area. We really want to get that back in range. Oh, hold on. Oh no. Okay. I had animated this this slide, so these should pop up separately. But they're all just there, so we're just going to work with that. So these are the test findings. Now we come on to the data, the really exciting stuff, and we're going to start with organic acids. So organic acids, as a general point, they are found in urine, so we measure them as metabolites basically, and they are metabolic byproducts or end products produced from the body's daily metabolic activities. They're kind of like your exhaust fumes of your car, if you want to think of it that way, and they just tell us a lot about functional health. So when we're looking at pathways, we're actually assessing enzymatic pathways in the body which require nutrients. So if we're lacking certain nutrients, we can see a backup in certain pathways, and that can increase the organic acids output in the urine. So different markers tell us different things, but collectively we can assess how certain areas of someone's body is working basically. I'm not going to go into the individual biomarkers. I'm going to give you the whole overview of the categories and what they mean. I'm going to leave the individual markers to everyone else who's coming to speak later, because they're using it in just a really cool like case study format, so it'll make more sense in those scenarios. So this is very much the overview of these groups. They are grouped based on their various utilities. So the digestive markers, which let's just do some pointing, is these. This is a key section just to give an overview of gut health. So certain bacteria produce organic acids, which can give an insight into possible malabsorption of, say, amino acids or just protein. We can identify if there's possible bacterial overgrowth, dysbiosis, yeast infections. You wouldn't know more than that. You'd have to then go on to do a stool test. So if these were raised, or if a whole chunk of them were raised, that's quite a key indicator. You might then want to move on to do a stool test, let's say the GI effects, as a second option. But alternatively, it just gives you that initial insight. The vitamin markers, which is on the top over here. So these are looking at B vitamins specifically. They do actually say in the bracket which specific ones we're looking at. If they're raised, this is an indicator we want to look at supporting them with more B vitamins, alpha-lipoic acid. Obviously, yellow, like, kind of want to start thinking about it. Red, definitely want to think about it. So we then have, you can't see, but the vitamin markers then has the methylation markers within it, which is looking for B12, folate need. There is also a biotin section, which is sneakily behind here, which is obviously measuring biotin, or the need for biotin. And then we have the energy markers, which I am going to brief over because we're going to focus on that section on the next slide. So, but obviously it's just telling us about energy markers, metabolism, etc. And then we have the neurotransmitter metabolites. So looking at neurotransmitter balance, we're looking at the kynurenine pathway, which is like a stress-induced pathway. Really important when we're looking at cognitive cases. If there's inflammatory cases going on as well, anything like that, there's a huge link with like kynurenic acid, quinolinic acid, and things like cognitive decline. So really key one if you've got any of those sorts of clients on your cases. Got the catecholamine markers, looking at the dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline pathway, serotonin marker as an intergestant for serotonin. And then the toxin and detox markers, these are the markers that are looking at environmental exposure to toxins. So things like petrochemicals, plastics, all of those sorts of things. And then also the need for possible glutathione as well. All right, my favorite slide. I absolutely love the mitochondria, I'll be honest. So this to me is like the best slide ever, but I'm going to focus on it purely because I enjoy it, but also because it is such a key aspect of the test. So we did see the energy markers before on the original slide, and then we put it into this beautiful diagram. And you can see obviously where anything's raised or low. It will also have a triangle next to it to show you. So let's just talk about the mitochondria because it's crucial, and it's a crucial part of the test. It's something we want to understand. So the mitochondrial dysfunction, what even does that mean? So if our mitochondria are obviously not working well or efficiently, it basically means we're in a state which hinders our ability to produce ATP. So we're looking throughout this entire section to see where the blocks are in the pathway that might be impacting that energy production. So just as a wow factor, one mitochondrion produces as much energy as a bolt of lightning, which mind-blowing. I am already mind-blown. So they're just amazing. So this is such a key aspect of just our general health. The function of our mitochondria underpins so many conditions, and they're really vulnerable at the same time. They're really vulnerable to toxicity, inflammation, exposure to oxidative stress, and so on. That can all obviously drive dysfunction. Obviously, if we're then lacking certain nutrients, that can drive dysfunction. So it's a huge area to certainly consider when working with clients. And obviously, we want to just make sure it's in good working shape. So we've all heard they are the engine or the powerhouse of a cell. And they underpin sort of four key categories or key areas. So our innate immune system, so they hugely regulate our immunity, energy production, obviously, autophagy, stem cell regulation, and also calcium balance. So that in itself obviously is like massive. It just speaks such volumes. They're basically imperative for cell function and survival. So our mitochondria decide whether a cell will live or die, and yeah, that obviously addresses in lots of conditions. So specifically, I've listed a few key ones, but obviously this is not exhaustive. Like there's so many conditions that require good mitochondrial health. But starting with like metabolic disorders, like cardiovascular disease, is a really key one because obviously our hearts basically have so many mitochondria within them. They have like, I think each heart cell has nearly 6,000 mitochondria within it, which just shows you how much obviously our heart relies on mitochondrial health. So if we have any cases of cardiovascular disease, or if anyone has like even cholesterol dysregulation or anything like that, we really want to consider how mitochondria are working. Absolutely, this is a fantastic opportunity to see how it is working. Then we also have things like type 2 diabetes, and in fact, like up to 30%, no, sorry, wrong way around. In type 2 diabetes cases, they're found to have up to 30% less mitochondria, which is crazy. So hugely important. Also, there is a way to increase that, which we'll have a look at on the next slide. But the whole process from this flow diagram is to look at how we metabolize our carbohydrates. So looking at, sorry, not carbs, macronutrients. So we have fatty acids, carbohydrates, proteins. Obviously, we then want to see how that metabolizes into acetyl-CoA to then eventually enter the citric acid cycle, get to the electron transport chain and produce the majority of our ATP. So all of that requires loads of nutrients to do it. So let's just take an example like fatty acids. So it requires magnesium and B2. So you will see cofactors needed for pathways listed next to them. So fatty acids have to go through beta oxidation for the most part, and that requires magnesium and B2 to do that. So if we're just as a starting point, if we're lacking magnesium and B2, we actually end up using a different pathway, which is called omega oxidation. That's when we see a raised acidic antibaric acid here. So just as a starting point, we might not be metabolizing our fats particularly well. This is an ideal opportunity to see what's needed to support that a bit better. Then we come into acetyl-CoA. Obviously, we can either go into ketogenesis, we can either go into citric acid cycle, and then into the electron transport chain. So you will see as well, there are some red circles on the outside. They're static, same on every test, but they're just giving you the inhibitors for this particular cog, if you like. So they contain heavy metals, which we also test for on this test. So you can really piece that whole puzzle together a bit more to see if If the reason they're not obviously utilizing that citric acid cycle well is maybe they've got toxicity going on, maybe they're lacking nutrients. Okay, so let's address mitochondria in disease. So we know the health of our mitochondria is super important for just overall bodily function. There is a direct relationship with our mitochondria and oxidative stress. So if we have mitochondrial dysfunction, we have an increase in reactive oxidative species, which can lead to oxidative stress, compromise our ability to produce ATP, and it can lead to, obviously dysfunction, basically. So factors to address are, obviously, we know we need nutrients to support this particular cycle. So nutrient deficiency is #1 for sure. Heavy metal toxicity, so that can, like I said, can impact the citric acid cycle in particular. Excessive caloric intake can actually put burden onto mitochondria. So also want to look at the amount of food someone is consuming, or maybe implement fasting techniques. Things like that have been shown to actually support mitochondrial health and regeneration. We also want to manage inflammation, and if they have an infection, certainly target that as well. Sedentary lifestyle can also impact mitochondria, so exercise is also a really good way to regenerate mitochondria. And then medications, so they can hugely impact obviously lots of pathways, but in particular the one that we're seeing here. So things like antibiotics is a really key one, but lots of medications can, which is why we know fatigue is such a common side effect we get with people on medications. So looking at the rest of the organic acids, we have the oxalate markers on the left-hand side. So these can form oxalic acid, which can then form kidney stones. So this is a really great tool if you've got any clients who have any kidney issues, maybe they suffer with kidney stone predisposition or risk. If you have anyone with glucose dysregulation as well, you might find these to be raised in those scenarios. So this could give you a bit of an insight into where their kidney function is at that point. And we also have the creatinine concentration. So this is a urinary biomarker on all of our profiles that are urinary. Basically, we ratio the organic acids to the creatinine as a laboratory standard. So it's basically influenced by muscle mass and kidney health. So if you have anyone with abnormal kidney function or kidney disease, that's heavily going to impact the rest of the biomarkers. So actually, we don't recommend it if someone has, sort of really poor kidney health. But if you find high or low results, there's some key options as to why. So if it was a high creatinine, maybe they're just dehydrated, maybe they're supplementing like a bodybuilder, maybe they do have or starting to have kidney disorders. A low creatinine, perhaps looking at muscle mass, perhaps looking at kidney disorders again. If it's like super high or super low, that can actually skew the rest of the results. If that does happen, you should be informed. If not, like, you would want to contact us anyway. I imagine you wouldn't. But yeah, it's a rare circumstance, but it can happen. If it's just super high, the overall result will then all shift to the very left-hand side. It looks very dramatic, so you definitely want to get in touch. And in that scenario, it's rare, but we would then absolutely retest that section, just to make you aware of that. So oxidative stress and antioxidants. So we measure the lipid peroxide A2HDG, which is an indicator of damage to cell membranes or damage to proteins like DNA. So super, super important. Obviously, if they're raised, we want to look at essentially blitzing with antioxidants. So we could start off by gauging their glutathione and CoQ10 levels. Obviously, if they're low, we really want to increase those. I'd say like a glutathione, you don't want it any lower than 1,000. That's probably where you want it to be, or plus. Obviously, if someone's taking statins or anything like that, you can gauge their CoQ10 also from this particular section. But yeah, obviously, you want to address things like the drivers of the oxidative stress, etc. Okay, let's move on. So amino acids. This is also measured in urine. So it's measuring recent intake of protein. We can also gauge the utilization of protein as well here. So as a starting point, just are they getting enough? The best way to look at it is just like a big pattern. It's just telling you something. So as a starting point, I would start down here with the dietary peptide markers, looking at their intake. Are they getting enough in as a starting point? The 1-methylhistidine here can actually be an indicator of, like in this scenario, this is fine, but if it was like super raised on its own, maybe they've got dysbiosis. It can also be a marker for that as well. But then we look at the amino acids up here, just how are they looking? Overall, not too bad, obviously a little bit mucosal here, but this is actually a pretty decent picture. And then we can look at the non-essentials. This whole process here requires a lot of B vitamins and magnesium. So if they, for instance, if you see these are all really good here, and then this will drop to the left, perhaps we really want to consider that conversion. If this was particularly high and then this was really low, maybe they're not digesting protein. So there's a whole sort of picture you can gauge from this particular section. A really key point to have is that a lot of these amino acids are precursors to lots of the pathways on the organic acids. So a really key one is going to be tryptophan, which is here, and then tyrosine, which is down here. So if we're looking at neurotransmitter pathways, they all heavily use things like tyrosine, tryptophan, things like that. So we really want to know where they're at with those particular nutrients, especially if you're dealing with like any cognitive clients, any clients that are suffering with inflammation, all of that sort of thing. So that whole thing that we've just looked at is the metabolomics, apart from the antioxidants, glutathione and CoQ10. Everything else we've just covered is the metabolomics. We're now going to move on to the rest of the NutrEval. So if you ordered the metabolomics, this is what you would get. So let's continue. So essential fatty acids. This is from whole blood, so it requires it's a blood spot. So they don't need a blood draw, but it's obviously measuring balance of essential fats. So we're looking at omega-3, 6, 9. We also get to look at the cardiovascular risk for the omega-3 index, measuring things like EPA and DHA. So super anti-inflammatory, obviously want that to be much higher, especially if you're dealing with someone with any sort of inflammation, basically. We also then get to look at the omega-9, which is great for things like the myelin sheath. So really good for anyone who's working with like MS clients. Obviously saturated fat. We can address things like palmitic acid, which we can talk about later if you want to chat about it. Trans fats, which obviously we really want to make sure where that is, especially again if you've got someone on a inflammatory diet. They want to see where the trans fats are, etc. So you can just get a really good overall picture. Super important for cellular communication, cell membrane health, any inflammatory disorders, classically neurobehavioral issues as well. So really key section. So nutrient elements and toxicity. So we also do measure on the NutrEval the vitamin D and homocysteine. They are just a direct measure, they're in blood. Obviously that does require a blood draw. Homocysteine then needs to be centrifuged, so you have to find someone who can do that. But that would also be included on the test. And then the last slide that I have is the nutrient elements and toxicity for the NutrEval. So we're looking at blood again. So heavy metal exposure, it's obviously going to be quite recent exposure. It's within the last like 120-ish days, or however long your red blood cell lives. That is what we're essentially measuring is for heavy metals within that. So the specific ones we have is lead, mercury, arsenic, and cadmium. Obviously, if they're present, we want to consider the impact that's going to have on our Krebs cycle. It can block certain pathways, as we saw. And obviously, we want to find the source of it. So we want to consider things like their water supply. Things like I actually had a client who we did the test, and she had like super high arsenic levels. And then I went to speak to her about it, and turns out she was like drinking out of a well. And then we got her well water tested, and it was like really high with arsenic. So that was fun. So we also have the nutrient elements, which are obviously these ones here, so copper, magnesium, manganese, potassium, selenium, zinc, which just tells you again just a direct measure of those specific nutrients. It's more reflective of dietary intake, but yeah, can just give you that bigger picture. So optional add-ons, genetic SNPs. This is for all tests. For the NutrEval and the Metabolomics, you can add on genetic SNPs. So They require a buccal swab. It'd just be an addition into your test kit that you'd receive. Just to give you further insight into things like methylation with the MTHFR, comp, if you've got someone who has like obviously hormonal conditions, things like that, you really want to look into that. You could have the comp on, ApoE for things like cholesterol regulation, TNF alpha for inflammation. As a whole, you can add them all on together if you wanted to have more of a genetic insight. It is just these four, so you can just pick and choose if you just wanted one or two or however you wanted to do it. Okay, so the standalone and retesting options. So as I said, the whole NutrEval is one big test. It's massive. So you can break it down. I like to think of it as like that's your starting point. You get a huge overall picture of someone's health, really can piece that puzzle together because you're looking at so many elements that are important. And then you have options to either retest, or then you could do segments of that NutrEval, which I think like the Metabolomix, where you just look at the organic acids and amino acids, the nutrient toxins. So depending on obviously what comes up, what you're working on, you can then retest that specific portion, see where you're at. So you have all of the options to do that. You just want to look at amino acids, nutrients, essential fat, or just toxic elements on their own. You have the options to do that. And then obviously you can, with the Metabolomics on its own, you can also then do add-ons. So you could then add on the essential fat, which is probably the most common add-on, I would say. So then you're getting a slightly bigger picture, which should still tell you a heck of a lot of information. Okay. Bit of admin. Test practicalities. Like I said, it has a urine and blood component. The urine is first morning void, so before they eat, drink anything, just that's when they do it. Blood sample is a fasted sample, so we say at least 8 hours. It needs to be centrifuged as well, so obviously you need to find a phlebotomist that can centrifuge, and that needs to be centrifuged within 15 minutes of that blood draw. Ideally, we suggest having 4 days of a clear out of non-essential vitamins and minerals. So if you're supplementing, even with like protein powders, energy drinks, anything like that, they can all have things in there like taurine or other aspects that can impact markers or can make markers look higher than they are or whatever. So we suggest at least a 4-day clear out. I personally always do a week just to be extra sure, but 4 days would be enough. Need to eat your normal diet. So making sure that your diet is or your client's diet is as normal as possible. Obviously you're measuring their current state of health, so keep it as normal as it normally is. Obviously don't go out and eat a massive steak if they never normally eat steak. Yeah, just keep it as normal as possible. Obviously avoid excessive fluid intake, because we do use creatinine as the sort of marker to ratio. The organic acids and amino acids, so important that they just stay regular hydrated. Your regular like 8 glasses a day is fine. Obviously don't go drinking like 4 liters or anything. Obviously avoid tackle kidney failure. We already talked about that. The turnaround time is approximately 21 days. Sometimes it's a little bit earlier, but it's around 21 days. There are obviously lots of things that can impact pathways, so like medications and things. So we do have a test prep page which goes into that in way more depth. Obviously you can ask us if you're still not sure, but everything else that I've not told you should be also available on that link. As a quick roundup, the summary, when to use this particular test, pretty much all the time. New clients is always my #1, just want to see what's going on, want to see how they're getting on, especially if they've got cardiovascular issues, especially if they've got diabetes, anything like that. Really want to know their function of health. But yeah, all of these conditions listed. If you've got anyone with insomnia, we have a lot of people with like autism or ADHD who also then go to this path with the add-on of like essential fats. We really look at like cell membrane support, all of that sort of a thing. Super, super helpful. And then last, this is actually the last slide. I think I've said that like 4 times, but this is the last slide. I do want to just quickly touch on the support you have from us. We have loads of support on our website. So we have support guides for most of our tests, especially our big tests like the NutrEval, GI effects, etc. All available on our website. We have webinars, which are brilliant, I must say. They're from the States, but they're like absolutely fantastic. They have lots of different guests on there doing talks as well, and they go into depth about lots of different aspects of testing. So fully recommend watching some of those. I think it's working, yeah. And then you have us, so on hand, so on email, on call, obviously today, just come over and have a chat. We are, yeah, you can chat to us about anything. Obviously, if it's about testing, what test to choose, you want to go through a report, anything like that, you want to piece it together with your client's case, because that's obviously a whole different game. We are 100% on board to do that. But yeah, so if you have any other questions at all, by all means, just come find me or find any of us. We'll be able to help you out. And I hope that's helpful. I hope that's cleared up some of the ambiguity between NutrEval and Metabolomix. But I'll hand you back to Alex, I guess. Thank you.